Good evening. Good evening and welcome. My name is Joyce Brown, and I am the president of the Fashion Institute of Technology, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening. I want to welcome you on behalf of FIT and our partners, the Institute for New Economic Thinking and Shakespeare and Company booksellers. We're all delighted that we could bring together two such eminent economists as Joseph Stiglitz and Paul Krugman as part of our Fashion Finance Forum to help us think through some of the economic challenges the country is facing today, especially with a presidential election that is just 2 weeks away. We all have a stake, in the outcome of the election and in the policies that affect our economy. And I want to say just a few words about why, as president of FIT, I worry every day about where our economy is going. You see, people forget, or perhaps they do not know, that FIT is a public institution. It's a college of the State University of New York, and so it is heavily dependent upon public funds, primarily from the state and the city. In addition, we're a community college, one that grants bachelor's and master's degrees. So I'll let you think about that for a while. As a career-based college, we are exactly the kind of institution the country and our policymakers look to today to prepare our 21st century workforce. So FIT's singular combination of business, design, and liberal arts education attracts 10,000 talented, deeply motivated, full and part-time students every year, each one of whom passionately wants to enter that workforce in the design or the fashion industries or the businesses that support them. We offer as many as 46 degree programs to help them do so. But like every educational institution, and perhaps especially every public educational institution, we are challenged almost every time there's a glitch in the economy, no matter how prudent our budget or how aggressive our fundraising. We're always battling cuts in our budgets despite the emphasis that policymakers and politicians put on education. It's no secret that state aid has dropped dramatically over the last decade throughout the nation. And here at FIT, we receive less in state aid today than we did 10 years ago. In fact, we've lost about 20% of our state funding just in the last 3 years alone. So a discussion of the kind we are about to hear will be very illuminating for all of us. And it will be especially important for our students, some of whom are here and will be voting in a presidential election for the very first time in their lives. For them, the opportunity to hear from these two distinguished and influential thinkers just before they go into that voting booth is a real privilege, just as it is for us as well. So now I am pleased to relinquish this podium to introduce Dr. Nancy Zimpfer, who is the Chancellor of the State University of New York.
Thank you, and good evening. I, too, am thrilled to be here. You have to know what a privilege it is to work with President Joyce Brown and to support the Fashion Institute of Technology. So we both welcome you. We are certainly privileged to be working with the Institute for New Economic Thinking and the Shakespeare and Company booksellers. I think we all feel that FIT, the Fashion Institute of Technology, is just a premier institution. It represents the State University of New York in such a fabulous way right here in the city, this great city on the planet. And so we appreciate the collaboration that went into the Fashion Finance Forum sponsoring this evening. I can imagine that there might be someone in the audience that does not know the scope and scale of the State University of New York, so I will say to you that we are the largest public higher education system in America. One of our distinctions is the sheer number of students we educate, about 465,000 students every year, about 89,000 degrees. That's so much why we cherish the work of FIT here in New York. Something else that's very distinct about us is that under one umbrella, we have 30 community colleges. We have liberal baccalaureate four-year institutions, medical schools, research institutions. We are the only system in the country that has the opportunity to integrate the sectors in such a way and to provide such a sterling group of citizens and employers, prospective employees each year. So when I first came to SUNY, one of the charges was to develop a strategic plan. A big fan of Jim Collins, and you know him from his authorship of Good to Great. We came upon a big, hairy, audacious goal that the State University of New York could be the economic engine for New York's economic revitalization. So the topics addressed this evening are near and dear to our central mission, is to use our mission of teaching and research and service in service to not only New York's economic revitalization, but the quality of life of our citizenry. That is such an audacious goal that we have broken it down into 6 big ideas. You would expect us to be innovators. You would expect us to care about healthcare, since we prepare so many healthcare professionals, about energy, about the vibrancy of our communities, about our role in the global economy and the international relationships we have. But one particular big idea so connects with the theme this evening, and that is our commitment to work with elementary and secondary education and early childhood education, and at the other end of the continuum with workforce development, to seal the leaks in the education pipeline, to close the achievement gap in America once and for all. Again, very fitting to the themes tonight. And then thirdly, to be able to introduce to the larger education community a concept that we now have on Wikipedia. Yes, we have invented a term. It's called systemness. And we've given Wikipedia a very sophisticated definition, but you know what? It really boils down to this, that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And that, friends, is the State University of New York. And that is why tonight we have many alumni, not only from FIT, but from across our 64 campuses, celebrating their relationship to the State University of New York. This is kind of new, our drive to find all 3 million of our alumni. So you have to know how privileged and thrilled we are to have 2 Nobel Prize winners in Joseph Stiglitz and Paul Krugman, forecasting the relationship, quite frankly, between education and economics and our future as a country. One of my favorite New York Times columnists, David Leonhardt, said this a few months ago: education, educating more people and educating them better, is simply the best bet any society can make. So without further ado, I want to turn the program over to Robert Johnson. He is the Executive Director for the Institute for New Economic Thinking, INET, and a Senior Fellow at the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Institute in New York. Dr. Johnson is an impressive moderator, a former senior economist with the U.S. Senate with degrees from Princeton and MIT. We welcome Dr. Johnson. Thank you, and enjoy this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the Fashion Institute of Technology and Shakespeare Books for hosting the event this evening. And I also am very excited, and I think we're all very excited, to see probably 2 people who are, I would say, unquestionably the most cited economists in the world today. And they, in addition to being most cited, and as you all know, both are Nobel laureates, I would have to say from the vantage point of the Institute for New Economic Thinking that if I were to nominate two people as being the most courageous economists in the world and the most impactful, these would be my two finalists. So I'm very excited to be part of this conversation with both of you. As you know, each of them has written a book that pertains to our current challenges and circumstance. Joe Stiglitz's book, The Price of Inequality, and Paul Krugman's book, End This Depression Now, are part of your goodie bag tonight. And therefore, on behalf of them, I'll thank you for your patronage. But I think we should move right to the discussion. Let's start with Paul. Paul, you talked about the title of your book, End This Depression Now. There are a lot of people who don't believe we could end this depression now. What agency do human beings have to take on this challenge?
Yeah, so I spend a fair bit of time looking back at the Great Depression, because I think what we're seeing is something that is recognizably the same kind of animal as the Great Depression. Obviously not as bad as the Great Depression. That's our optimistic slogan. Not as bad as the Great Depression, but really pretty bad, and recognizably the same kind of thing. The technology is still there, the human skills are still there, the resources are there, but we're not actually making use of them. And so we're in that same kind of slump. And if you go back to the 1930s, you find a lot of people making the argument that there were no easy answers, no quick fix, and that it was absurd to think that you could quickly get out of this. Absurd to think that, particularly that these Keynesian types who said that all we need is an increase in government spending to boot us out, it's crazy. And there are wonderful, there are articles in 1939 published in the American Economic Review explaining that these are fundamental problems, and what we really need to do if we want to make progress is structural reform and cut unemployment benefits and things like that. And then along came, not actually the war, but just the war came in Europe, and the United States began preparing. We began our military buildup really in 1939, and within 2 years, total employment had increased by 20%, the equivalent of adding 27 million jobs right now, just like that. And it turned out that the only problem was there was not enough spending in the economy, and there was one player in the economy who could and should have been spending more, which was the government. And thanks to Adolf Hitler, all of a sudden, that player finally did what it should have been doing all along and began increasing spending. It's the same thing right now. There's overwhelming confirmation now that this is a time when having the government spend more would be really free. It would be putting people to work who would otherwise be unemployed. It would be putting capital to work that would be basically doing nothing. And it's actually very easy technically. It's very hard politically because it's very hard to persuade people of the need to do that, which is why some of us write books.
Now, some of those who would argue with you would say, you do the spending, it's like a sugar pill. It gives you a boost for a transient period of time, and then you fall back. But we didn't fall back into the Depression after World War II. What happened?
I think it's a very interesting story, right? If you want to ask the question, why did World War II, why wasn't it a temporary, but why didn't we slide back into the Depression, which lots of people thought we would. Mm-hmm. In fact, there were this famous story, Montgomery Ward was a major store chain, but the president of Montgomery Ward believed that the Great Depression was going to come back, and so he hoarded cash instead of building stores and kept on waiting for the Depression to come back, and by the time it became clear it wasn't going to, they had basically lost their position in the marketplace. So it was not a question that's been studied as much as it should have been. But the best going story right now about what is really going on, which is also the best going story about what was really going on in the 1930s, it was about excessive private sector debt. That you'd had a debt bubble that, when it burst, left people stranded with too much debt. And what happened during World War II was that we had, first of all, a period of very full employment, which made it easy for people to pay down debt. They also couldn't borrow, so they were more or less forced to pay down debt, plus a significant amount of inflation, so that the real value of the debt fell. And so you came into World War II with quite high levels of private debt, of household debt relative to income, and by the time the war under half what they had been before the war, and so you'd solve the problem. And so the best thing you can do, if your problem is excessive indebtedness. What you want is a strong economy, and maybe a little bit of inflation, but certainly a strong economy, so that people have a chance to pay that debt down, and then it does not come back. It's not a sugar high. It actually is, it's more like a diet of essential nutrients that enables you to actually recover from your ailment.
There are a couple of other factors that I'd add. There was some sense for savings during the war,
Yeah.
and that meant when we got after the war, people just had very strong balance sheets which they could spend. At the same time, part of the problem at the time of the Great Depression was that we had to move people from agriculture into industry. The problem is, we had been a success because we had increased agricultural productivity enormously in the 19th century. In the 19th century, we still had 60-70% of the people working in farming. By 1930, it was down to about 25-30%. Today, we have 2%. But we had to move them into manufacturing, from rural to urban. They didn't have the resources to do it. But in the war, they had to move because that's where the plants were. So we began to equip people for this new middle-of-the-century industrial economy. And then we did something important. We had the GI Bill. So we gave them the education that made them suited for this new economy. So we were actually, it was not just the government was spending. Government, unintentionally in a sense, was restructuring the economy, making it prepared for the post-war period. Alex Fields also has a really interesting book on the history of this period. And he also pointed out that in the period of the 30s, the government was actually doing a lot of investment in roads. And that increased productivity. And that after the war, that productivity actually increased the returns to investment in the private sector. Mm-hmm. And so it created the context, plus a lot of R&D that was done during the war. So we had a backlog. Public spending had provided a context in which private investment had a higher return.
Yeah, this is actually an important point. It's, in general, we've got this notion that the public sector and the private sector are always in competition. But quite a lot, especially public investment, is complementary to private investment. I mean, there's a lot of things that people will do if they believe that there's an adequate transportation network, if they believe that the power network is adequate, if they believe that they're going to have skilled workers available because they've had good education. And sure, I think I tend to be strip it down to the minimal story, and my minimal story would be just about the debt. But the other stuff is there as well, and of course all of this reinforces just how crazy what we're doing right now is. I mean, we have states and mostly state and local governments canceling infrastructure projects because revenue is depressed, because the economy is depressed, which is exactly the opposite of how we got out of the Great Depression, right?
And in fact, I mean, one way we haven't focused on, Europe talks about austerity. We don't talk about it, but we're practicing it.
Yeah, we do it. If you actually look at the measures for austerity,
we have
we're
about
not that different.
600,000, 700,000 fewer public employees than we did before the crisis, when if we had a normal expansion corresponding to the increase in the labor force, we would have gained about 1.2 million employees. So there's a big gap there caused by this kind of austerity that we already have. To me, the real danger is if the Romney gets elected, they might actually do what they say they might do.
Right.
And
that is a remarkable feature of the current political environment, that your best hope is that one of the candidates is in fact lying through his teeth about his plans.
We sit now in what feels like prolonged stagnation. Joe, you've written a book on inequality. This cannot be a positive development for the distribution of proceeds, to have idle labor, what they call the reserve army of the unemployed, driving wages down, weakening the bargaining power.
Yeah, inequality has become a serious problem, I think, in the United States. I mean, what's interesting, while Paul has been arguing about this, and I've been arguing about it for a long time, it's gotten so serious that even the economist realizes
Yeah.
that it's a serious problem. When they say it's a serious problem, you got to believe it.
I mean, the magazine, The
The
Economist from
magazine,
the UK.
not our colleagues, no, but the magazine, The Economist.
Our colleagues will never wake up. No, sorry.
No, it's my job to take them on. You
Right.
guys take on the magazine.
So, and one of the reasons that it weakens the economy, what Paul has emphasized, that the problem right now is lack of demand, lack of total demand, and that means people are not buying as many goods as the economy has the capacity to produce, and that leads to unemployment. Well, one of the problems is if you transfer money from the bottom of the economic pyramid to the top, the people at the top save about 15% of their income. The people at the bottom spend everything. I mean, they need to spend everything to get by. And so when you engage in that kind of transfer, it lowers total aggregate demand. There is now a vicious cycle going on that because of the high unemployment, wages are being driven down. The share of wages is weaker than it otherwise would be. And so that, in turn, weakens demand. And even before the crisis, incomes in the middle were not doing very well. Median income today is lower than it was a decade and a half ago. So there is a vicious circle in place where a weak economy leads to more inequality, leads to a weaker economy.
Yeah, well, we could go out there. There's some technical. I don't want to go too deep into the weeds here. I'm not totally persuaded of that channel, as it turns out, because in fact the overall savings rate, even now, is still well below what it was in 30 years ago. We used to have like 8% private savings, and now it was 0 for a while there. It's around 4 now, and so there's something. That the debt issues, I think, are very real. The inequality leads many people to go into debt to attempt to maintain a middle-class standard of living. Actually, above all, an attempt to have a house in a middle-class neighborhood so their kids could have a decent school. But I'm not sure that I think there's a story that runs through debt rather than just a simple mechanical inadequate spending.
The point, I guess, we should be aware. A lot of the discussion talks about the American consumers coming back. And before the crisis, the savings rate in the United States was 0.
Yeah.
And we hope it won't come back
That's
in
right.
that way. That was obviously not sustainable. And as one of my predecessors as chairman of the council once said, that which is not sustainable is not going to be sustained.
Now I thought the canonical version, this is Stein's law, was if something cannot go on forever, it will stop.
But the point is that if you roughly divide the population, the upper 20% historically saved about 15% of their income. But they have now about 40% of all the income. And if you just do that arithmetic, that means that we should be expecting a 6% savings rate rather than the 4.5% that we have now. So in some sense, savings are depressed relative to what we might have expected. So it is even conceivable, as people get adjusted to new standards of living, that we will see the savings rates increase from the current 4.5% level. And that is another reason why we should be worried over this long recession, that the restorative forces in place on their own are very weak.
With regard to inequality in your study, we talked a little bit about the prolonged slump as a contributing factor. What other dimensions do you see as causes of inequality?
Well, there are lots of causes of inequality, and there are lots of dimensions to inequality. There's, the fraction of the income that's going to the top, the hollowing out at the middle, and the increase in the number of people in poverty at the bottom. And each of them has their own causes, and multiple causes. At the top, which has gotten a lot of attention, the 99% and 1%, one of the factors that is to say even the economist has now recognized, and that I talk about in my book, is that a lot of the income at the top comes from what economists call rent seeking. That is to say, things like monopoly power, activities where people are trying to grab a larger share of the pie rather than trying to make the economic pie bigger. Other examples besides, a monopolist gets his profits by reducing production rather than, restricting production. Other examples were the exploitive activities of the financial sector, where they were moving money from the bottom of the pyramid to the top through abusive credit card practices, predatory lending, a whole set of things that have now been exposed. That wasn't making the economy more efficient. Arguably, it was actually making it even more unstable. And Paul Volcker said there wasn't a single financial innovation that had led to the increase in productivity of the American economy, except the ATM machine. And what he was wrong was the ATM machine is a British innovation, not an American innovation.
And since he said that, they raised my fees from $1 to $3.
Right. So that's another example. The CEOs have taken advantage of deficiencies in corporate governance to increase the share of the corporate income that they get. No evidence that they've become that much more productive or that they're that much more productive than CEOs in other parts of the world. But what they have become is better at getting a larger share of the pie. You have to admit there's a certain amount of cleverness in that. But it hasn't led our economy to be more efficient. In fact, money that could have gone into investment or R&D is spent on their salary.
Yeah, I like to do a division. Take the U.S. economy since the early post-war years, and it roughly divides about in half at this point into two eras. The first era was the sort of legacy of the New Deal, which was an era of where corporations viewed themselves as being more of a kind of coalition of stakeholders rather than just ruthless capitalism, fairly strong labor unions, of course, quite high tax rates at the top. And then the second era, which is this era of financial capitalism, deregulation, capitalism red in tooth and claw, and there's a widespread belief. Talk to people, talk to an anchor on CNBC, and they just know that transition from the old stodgy thing to the new, that led to an explosion of economic growth and higher efficiency, and it must have made everybody better off, and it's absolutely not true. Growth was slower in the second half, and of course, the big difference is that the benefits of growth stopped being spread to the general population. They all went to a relative handful of people at the top. My complaint about Occupy was that they're actually setting the cut too low. It's not even really the 1%, it's the 0.1% that the people have really made big.
And in the earlier period, I mean, Paul was absolutely right about it. In the earlier period, every quintile, every fifth of every group in the population was growing, but the bottom part was growing faster than the top. Today, it's not that way, and GDP doesn't really give you a good measure of what's happening to our economy, to our society. So while that 0.1% has been doing very well, 1% doing very well, median income is lower than it was a decade and a half ago. Median wealth is as low as it was 2 decades ago. So all the increase of wealth has gone to the top. So it's clear that in these ways, our economy hasn't been functioning as well as it did in that period in which we were growing together.
Paul, you're one of the leading thinkers about what they call new trade theory. And international issues relate to inequality. We've seen a tremendous amount of fights in Ohio just in the last month or so between Romney and Obama over the role of China in all of this. How do you see international factors?
Yeah. So there's several different pieces there. One of them, just coming back to why is our economy depressed? We used to have much higher private savings rates than we do now. how were we able to have full employment given that? We did not have consistent large budget deficits. What was filling the hole, or what makes it so much harder? And if you just sort of do the adding up, it is the persistent trade deficit. We used to not have one, and now we do, and that's a big drag on the economy, which has gotten better, actually. Trade deficit is actually significantly down, and some of it is just because our economy is depressed, but not all of it. We've actually had some. The U.S. has actually become more competitive, but that's a front on which we need to work, and there is the trouble is the political debate has not kept up with the reality here. It's all about China. Actually, China is no longer the core of that anymore. It's a much broader set of countries, something to be worked on. So I hope that the next president, instead of not just crude China bashing, but will try to say what do we need to do to have a world that is no longer, basically a world in which we don't have everybody trying to run a trade surplus, which the Germans believe is possible, but the rest of us have this problem with the arithmetic. Then there's the issue of trade and income inequality. And much used to be that we traded mostly with countries, at least manufacturing goods, we traded with countries that were at similar level of economic development. And that presumably had relatively little effect on income distribution. If you make, if the U.S. sends auto parts to Canada and Canada sends assembled cars back to the United States, that's not going to be making a big difference that's just increased efficiency. Now we do a lot of our trade with countries that are substantially lower income and are selling us labor-intensive products. That's probably increasing inequality through skill differentials. The highly educated tend to do better, although most of our increase in inequality is not simply highly educated versus less educated, but part of it is, and that's an increasing factor. So I had an interesting evolution myself. I was writing papers 18 years ago, 17 years ago, saying that trade isn't that big a factor in inequality because the numbers are just not big enough, which was true 17 years ago. But Canada, China and Mexico are a much bigger factor in our trade now than they were then, and so that is some. Now the question is, what do you do about it? And there are a lot of reasons not to want to have protectionism. Certainly not to have a general return to a protectionist world, if nothing else, because we're supposed to be global citizens at least a little bit. And for the very poorest countries, having access to open world markets is critical. Bangladesh almost literally keeps its head above water only because it can export labor-intensive products. The right way to deal with it is to have a decent society with a strong social safety net. So
it's more than a safety net. I mean, it's training programs,
right? Everything,
and give people skills. I mean, the standard theory is that with open markets, the winners, the country as a whole could be better off. The winners could compensate the losers, but they never do. And that's really the problem, that in fact, some of the advocates of globalization, at the same time that they're talking about the wonders of globalization, have been saying to compete, you have to strip away the social safety net. And in that sense, they're doubly hurting the people in the middle and the bottom.
Yeah, it's worth actually, Germany is an interesting case. Now, Germany is doing relatively well in this crisis. Not, I think, as well as they think they are, but they're doing relatively well. If the euro breaks up, then they'll discover that they have some problems. What's been really amazing is to watch conservatives in this country adopt Germany as an icon. They say, well, they've got austerity, which they really don't. But anyway, but if you actually look, why is Germany able to export so well? They pay very high wages, even by our standards. They have a very extensive welfare state to a level that's beyond the wildest dreams of American progressives. But what they have is, among other things, very good technical education, very close collaboration between the educational system and industry, strong role of government, a system of corporate governance that is much more like what we used to have in this country. Actually, labor is represented on the boards of companies, all of which suggests that if you really want to be able to be a high-wage country competing in the global economy, you actually want to move in the opposite direction from what people who say that we must slash social programs You actually want a more integrated, more cohesive society.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, the Scandinavian countries
Scandinavians
have done much better in this crisis, have grown faster, and have been more stable.
If you look at Sweden, look at what they do, and you just described it in the abstract without saying it had anything to do with a particular country, and put that in front of what is the conventional wisdom about how economics works here, we would say there must be grass growing in the streets. They can't possibly survive as an economy. And actually, I sometimes still run across people, less so in the last couple of years, but who are just sure that there must be terrible, terrible economic situation there. I say, have you ever visited Stockholm? Have you ever walked around? This does not look like a desperate place. This actually looks like they're doing pretty well.
But can I come back to the issue of inequality and globalization and talk about Germany? Because I think that they've done a lot of the things in the right direction, but they haven't really kept up with the Scandinavian countries. And the result of that is that while 30 years ago, they were in the middle of the advanced industrial countries in terms of inequality.
They mean Germany?
Germany.
Or
They were one of the better countries. They were not as good as Scandinavia, but they were.
Right.
They've now moved into the middle. And the point of this is that, to a large extent, inequality is the result of what we do. It's not just market forces. Market forces are at play in Scandinavia, in Germany, in the UK, and we shape those market forces. And the way we've shaped those market forces has resulted in the most inequality of any of the advanced industrial countries and the least equality of opportunity. Very contrary to our image of ourselves. It's not a American dream. It's really a myth. And what you've also seen over time is how countries that, interestingly, have imitated the United States have done like the United States. The UK used to be in the middle of the league table, and now it's second to the United States in terms of inequality. Whereas Scandinavia has kept up, it's struggled, and inequality has increased a little bit, but it is still the most equality of opportunity and the least inequality.
Yeah, I think this comes down to, there's this fatalism that, it's a global economy, there's nothing you can do, it's going to be extremes, you just cannot have the kind of relatively equal society and social justice that maybe was possible back when the rest of the world was in ruins. I get that all the time. But you just look at it and you say, well, there are countries that, the Scandinavians managed to maintain a high level of a widespread distribution of the benefits of economic growth and high productivity. You do not have to be the way we are. I mean, even Canada is a much less harsh, unequal society than ours, and they're obviously operating in pretty much the same environment we are. For the most part, they even speak the same language, and it's showing that these are choices. So as you say, it's choices both about how we run markets, because the distribution of market income is not something that's God-given. There's a lot you can do to influence that, and it's a choice about what you do afterwards as well. And whether you provide universal health coverage, whether you provide decent support, whether you provide an educational system that is well-funded for everybody, not just for people who happen to live in the right neighborhoods.
Yeah. And also the tax system is obviously important. And all of these are important not only for the issue of inequality, and opportunity, but also for efficiency and growth. So, for instance, if you have a tax system like ours, where speculators are taxed at a fraction of the rate of people who work for a living, or if you can keep your money in a bank account in the Cayman Islands rather than in the United States, you have incentives. Those rules not only give lower tax rates to those who can avail themselves of these, but it distorts the economy. You wind up with more speculation, more instability, and the money isn't in the Cayman Islands because it grows better in the sunshine there. In fact, it's the lack of sunshine that is the reason that people keep their money there. I
just had a conversation with someone from the financial industry who was trying to make the defense about things like carried interest, that's special, which isn't even investment income, but it gets taxed still as if it was, and it's 15%. And, well, but there's a lot of effort put in, and with uncertain return, and so you need to. And I couldn't help. You know what else involves a lot of effort with uncertain return? Writing books. And somehow I don't get that tax break, you don't get that tax break, but there we are.
Yeah. Just to clarify that this question of carried interest, when a fund, private equity or hedge fund, earns money from their customers, they earn a fee. That is their income. They're allowed to defer that. When I used to work in the hedge fund industry, you could defer that, keep it invested in your business, and at the end, on any gain you paid capital gains, but on the original fee income, you paid income tax.
Right.
Now, they've transformed that income into a capital gain,
right,
which it is not. It is income. This is legalized fraud, essentially.
Yeah. A lot of that in our system.
Confessions of a former hedge fund manager. Anyway, healthcare. You talked, the phrase you used was how we manage our markets. Now, I remember thinking one of the most profound papers I read, I'm the son of a doctor, was Ken Arrow's paper in the early 1960s on why healthcare is different. Why doesn't free market recipe work for a healthcare system, and what other designs do we have to do to take care of that?
So what Arrow did, said, we have a picture, we have this wonderful idealized version of a market that's in all of our textbooks, and in which a market is a perfectly efficient way to organize activity. And not necessarily fair, which is a different question, but at least it's efficient. And there are a bunch of things that you need, there are a bunch of assumptions that are involved. There are assumptions that everybody has the same information. There's an assumption that everybody knows what they're doing, that the buyers understand what the sellers are providing, that you are able to make informed decisions. And what Ken Arrow did, great economist Kenneth Arrow, in more than, I guess, almost 60 years ago now, he said, look, if you made a list of these things and thought about the various ways in which markets can fail, in which this paradigm doesn't apply, every one of those things applies to healthcare. Healthcare is the absolute nightmare for the proposition that markets are a good way to organize things. That you have asymmetric information of various kinds. People may have a better notion of well, first of all, you have to rely on insurance. You cannot have a healthcare, because the big costs are unpredictable and huge if they occur. Very few people can afford to pay for it out of pocket. So already you're having to rely on third-party payers, which is going to be a big problem for any kind of efficiency. You have a situation where, when applying for insurance, people may know more about their health condition than the insurers do. On the other hand, in dealing with healthcare issues itself, those are highly technical. You're not going to be able to know whether your doctor is recommending the right thing. So there's a whole set of...
I mean, you're a patient, not a consumer.
You're a patient, that's right. This notion that we actually talk about healthcare consumers, then that has become standard language, and it's deeply disturbing, right? I am not consuming healthcare. I'm receiving it. I'm a patient, and of course, then the notion that you even see people talking about, well, people need to be able to do comparative shopping, and right, you've just been rushed into the emergency room with a heart attack, and you say, no, I think they have a better deal at the hospital down the. And one thing, and Arrow actually said that he pointed out that a lot of the things we do in healthcare, or we did in healthcare 60 years ago, were obviously responses to this. We expect an ethical standard from doctors that you don't expect from used car salesmen, because a used car salesman who misleads you is not going to kill you. And so you have a lot of, and what was happened is, okay, so healthcare happens to be all just on general principles, an area where free market principles do not apply.
Can I just add one thing? What's so remarkable about Ken Arrow was that for 200 years, or 175 years before he had written, there was this very influential idea of Adam Smith that the market markets would lead, pursuit of self-interest would lead, as if by an invisible hand, to the efficiency of the economy. And Ken Arrow was the person who actually proved the circumstances under which it was correct. So if anybody who talks about the wonders of the free market, he was the one who actually showed that Adam Smith was right. But in showing it was right, he also understood that it was only right under very restricted conditions. And the healthcare sector was one condition in which it was never right. And, you know, some of my own work on economics of asymmetric and information.
Chef's mentioned that. That's the core to understanding this is Joe's work.
What it showed is the reason the invisible hand seems invisible is that it's not there. And this sector is a real case at point.
And just to add, then, this is all abstract reasoning, but then you look at reality, and it's overwhelming. Looking across countries, the United States has the most market-oriented healthcare system, and also by far the most expensive, without getting better results.
Poor results.
Yes.
We're ranked 37th in the world by the World Health Organization in terms of quality.
Right, and within the United States, although Medicare is very expensive, it's actually been much more successful at cost control than private insurers have been. Medicaid even more successful, and the great thing about America is we're so big and diverse that we actually have everything, all possible systems exist in some version here. The Veterans Health Administration, which is true socialized medicine, actually the government, you know, the doctors are government employees, is incredibly efficient relative to the rest of our healthcare system.
Yeah, Rob, you did a calculation that showed that if we had a healthcare system that was as efficient as the best in Europe,
Or France, Canada, Germany, or the UK. You can take your pick.
we would have no deficit.
Yeah, given the baby boom demographics.
That's right. Everyone else, not everyone, but these systems, which vary, right? Canada is just a single payer system, but not socialized medicine. It's actually even called Medicare, but it's Medicare for everybody. France is complicated. It's very Gallic, but it's a mixture of public provision, public health insurance, but it's a much heavier hand of government than the Canadian system. It's about the same cost as the Canadian system, but spectacularly good outcomes relative to anybody's. And Britain has a system which is pure socialized medicine, and the outcomes are a little better than ours, and the cost is 40% of ours. So sure, all of these things, and of course, if we were able to emulate these things, we would be able to, our budget problems would be gone.
And also our competitiveness of firms based in the United States might be enhanced.
And it's just, of course, defies, so what is one of our two presidential tickets, the signature proposal is to take one of the parts of our system that works pretty well and privatize it.
Repeal what he did as a governor.
Well, Romney, let's make sure that nobody else gets to do what I did as governor of Massachusetts, but then Paul Ryan wanting to essentially privatize Medicare. Privatize and underfund it, so dismantle Medicare, which is incredible. It's a rejection of both theory and evidence. That's pretty impressive.
When you look at this interface between medical costs and the budget, this idea that we have to have all these commissions like Bowles-Simpson and all of these rituals about shares between spending and so forth, why don't we just have a healthcare cost commission? Why don't we look that in the eye?
Because that would be death panels. No, I mean, that's true.
But I also think we have to, the reality of American politics is the drug industries are very influential. The insurance industry is very influential. And it has beaten back reforms over and over again. I mean, you take one provision in the, one line almost in the Medicare drug bill, the bill that provided prescription drugs for Medicare, and it said that the government, the largest purchaser of drugs in the world, couldn't bargain with the drug companies, that estimated to be a gift to the drug companies over 10 years of $500 billion. Now, you know, anybody serious about dealing with our deficit, that's a good place to begin. But hardly talked about.
And by the way, it creates an interesting problem for, if you're an economist or just an advocate, how much imperfection are you willing to accept? How much falling short? There was a little bit of a dilemma. A lot of us really thought that a lot of us, I really think that healthcare reform should take the form of single payer. The Medicare for all is where we should go. But that wasn't on the table. So the question is, so we had this plan for originally Jacob Hacker's plan, which became the part of the genesis of Obamacare eventually, which was to have something which was actually run through the markets. It's a Rube Goldberg device that manages to try and get at the effects of a single payer system without the actual single payer, but should have a public option in there. So it's not entirely the playing field of the insurance companies. Then the public option gets killed in the political scrim. Do you still support it? And in the end, my judgment was, yes, you do, because the important thing right now for us is to establish the principle of universal health care. And once that's in place, then there'll be a lot of pressure to make it more efficient, to make it work better. Eventually, we'll manage to squeeze the insurance companies out of their controlling role. But first, get it in place. And that's, of course, that more than anything else is what's at stake in this election.
So some people would say that we had, 47 million people uninsured who came onto the scrolls with the health care passage.
That's right.
But that's transformed into a budget problem because they're paying monopoly prices for the various services.
It turns out not to be a big deal. The amazing thing is the uninsured in America are by and large young adults, which are not expensive. The expensive people are the elderly who are covered under Medicare.
And the other aspect of that is that America is not so inhumane that at the end, when they need, is desperate, they do get into a hospital, but because it's been delayed, the costs are larger, and then it gets shifted in the complicated accounting that they have to somebody else. So, in fact, one of the reasons why we have such an inefficient healthcare system is that we don't provide access
care
to large fractions of our population.
Yeah, and the amazing thing when all is said and done is that getting to a sort of universal healthcare system, despite the absence of a public option, despite the compromises made, is really not a big budget buster. They were able to pay for it with relatively modest cost-saving measures in Medicare, and a little bit of extra taxation. And on balance, Congressional Budget Office says that the health reform bill is actually going to reduce the budget deficit, not increase it, and it's not going to lead to huge burdens on the public. So now it may die. That's as I say, that's really very much at stake in 2 weeks. If Obama's reelected, this thing survives. America finally joins the community of civilized nations that provide some form of health insurance to all their citizens. If he loses, then it gets killed.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth commenting the sense in which we are out of tune with the rest of the advanced industrial countries. Sarkozy, who was on the right in France, came to Columbia and gave a talk. And at the time that Obama, the health care bill was under discussion, and one of the students asked him to comment on this debate. And he said, well, I don't want to meddle in your affairs, but... And then he said, I don't understand it. In France, we take it as a basic right, a human right, that you should have access to health care, no matter what your income level is. So for us, we just don't, and this is a question of the right and the left. This is a basic human rights, and he just couldn't understand American
the Olympic
debate.
ceremonies in Britain with the dancing nurses, which people here said, what is that about? But of course, the British love their health system. We think that it's if you've listed people here, it's a hellhole and disaster. Actually, if you've ever been treated in it, it's not. But it's it's. And by the way, the thing about the politics of it is, if we get it, almost immediately it will become irreversible. It will be, people will say, find it inconceivable that we would stop
it's like
providing
Medicare.
coverage.
It's like Medicare, that most Americans really think is a good system. In fact, you know, the joke in the debate about the Obamacare was a person who said, I want you to keep the government's hands off of Medicare.
That's not a joke. It really happened.
And
there were quite a few people who were saying, don't let the government get its hands on Medicare.
Yeah. And that actually, I think, raises a fundamental issue that we've been circling around, which is what is the role of government in our society, in our economy? And for 30 years now, Americans have been sold a bill of goods that government can't do anything well.
It's the problem, not the solution, as Ronald Reagan said.
And therefore, you know, if Medicare is successful, it can't be a government program.
Right.
And the same thing in terms of Social Security. They find it very difficult to believe that the transaction costs associated with Social Security are a fraction of that of any private insurance companies providing annuities, and it provides the kinds of insurance against inflation, against other things that you can't get in a private insurance, private annuity. So, you know, that really raises, I think, deeper issues that have been at the center of this campaign.
There was a study done in Oslo a couple of years ago. A number of people participated in it. Studied Germany, the UK, the United States, and Sweden. And they asked a battery of questions. And not surprisingly, the United States respondents distrusted government more than any of the other countries. And the one question that stood out is, do I trust our government to protect me from powerful interests? And the American answer, no, was off the scales. It was 10 or 15 points more distrust.
You know, part of the reason for that may be related to the subject of inequality that we've been talking about, that, and Paul has written about this as well, that we have such a high level of inequality, economic inequality, that inevitably it gets translated into political inequality, and particularly given the rules of the game. Just like the rules of the economic game determine how the economic system plays out and lead to this high level of inequality, we now have political rules of the game, like Citizens United, that give scope for money, so we've moved closer to a system rather than one person, one vote, to $1, one vote. And then that becomes a self-reinforcing, so you have more political inequality that generates laws and regulations that lead to more economic inequality, and that reverberates back into more political inequality. You know, example that I just find astounding are something like our bankruptcy law. You know, it's something very technical. Nobody normally gets interested in. One provision of the bankruptcy law is that when you go bankrupt, the question is who gets paid first? That's the big issue. And the answer is the derivatives. Not a surprise, because they put it in when everybody else was not noticing what, you know, who pays attention to bankruptcy laws. But what does that mean? That means you encourage that kind of economic activity. But at the other extreme, student loans can't be discharged even in bankruptcy. So that means that the banks do well, but it really discourages people borrowing for student loans. And in a country where we have tuition going up, in the last 3 years, I think average state university tuition has gone up about 40% because of the cutbacks in
state budgets.
In state budgets. Yeah. Incomes are going down. The only way that people can afford it is borrowing. And then they realize that if they get cheated, as a lot of them have been, particularly in the for-profit private schools, the result of that is that if you don't get a job, given the recession, it's a noose around your neck.
You're both teachers. What do you tell young people right now? They're looking at those tuition bills and those loan rates.
Oh.
And the unemployment level for youth.
You know, the problem, I don't know, Joe must have something like this. The problem is that Princeton is such a rarefied right? It's very,
It's
it's
the
not,
1%.
It is the 1% or less.
The 1/10 of 1%.
And to the extent that students are not coming from the 1%, they've got a pretty generous scholarships because the school has a lot of money. So I don't think it's a fair.
It's not frightening.
But no, I mean, but I certainly have, young people I know, relatives, and for really urging them to find ways to not be dependent. And we've got a nephew, thank God, teaching English in Japan, so he's got a job, and urging him to stay there until the job market is better here. Because this is, by the way, this sort of comes back. We sort of moved off the questions of the current depressed economy, but among other things, when people say, well, can we really afford to spend to boost the economy? The costs of not doing that are a lost among other things, a lost generation of young people. This is a terrible job market. Young people are coming out of school, out of college, or even if they choose not to go to college, coming out of high school, into a market that has no use for them. They never get that first job that makes use of their potential. They never get started on the ladder. And we're going to be paying a price for our inaction in the face of mass unemployment. We're going to be paying that price 30 years from now still because of what we're doing to the human potential of this nation.
Yeah, Paul is absolutely right, and it's particularly foolish. Right now, the U.S. government can borrow at a negative real interest rate.
That's right.
So,
the U.S. government sells, among other things, bonds that are protected against inflation. So the value won't be eroded by inflation. And the interest rate on 10-year inflation-protected bonds is minus 0.8% right now. So people are willing to pay the U.S. government to take their money.
So once you recognize that, and you recognize that we have these high-return investments in technology, infrastructure. Anybody look at the infrastructure in New York, you have the feeling that we're a third world country, except it's an insult to some third world countries. And you realize, investments in technology that would really provide the basis. We began by talking about how we got out of the Great Depression. Those kinds of investments would be a complement to the private sector and create jobs now and promote growth in the future and improve our fiscal position, because you have these positive real returns and the negative real cost of funds. Anybody looking at the balance sheet say you're crazy not to do it.
Well, my pet thing, of course, is that the greatest city and the greatest nation in the world is linked to all points west by a single rail tunnel completed in the year 1910. And the project, the long-standing project to add which runs at 100% of capacity during rush hour, and the long-standing project to add a second tunnel has been canceled at a time when the federal government can borrow at negative real interest rates. Incredible.
And all of these idle resources do not pay taxes.
Right. No,
people are worried about the debt overhang.
Larry Summers and Brad DeLong. Now that he's a free man, Larry is sounding a lot more like Joe and me, actually. But they had a paper making a very strong, persuasive case that even in purely fiscal terms, spending more money now is a positive. That what it will do to the long-term budget, long-term U.S. economic growth will more than pay for itself in future tax revenue. That's because the borrowing costs are so low and because the long-term shadow of mass unemployment on the economy is quite large. So yeah, and conversely, cutting back at times like this is self-defeating. It actually worsens the fiscal situation. And of course, then what happens is people say, well, got to inflict more pain because the fiscal situation. It really is like medieval doctors who thought that you treated illness by bleeding people, and then when they got sicker, so you bled them some more. And that's our economic policy these days.
Well, I'm getting depressed listening to you two guys, so I have to turn to the audience now.
Yeah.
Do people have questions? There are, I believe, microphones at a couple of places.
Seem to be at either.
Please come up. We've got some time for some questions. Yes, sir.
Let me, if I can make an observation before I pose my question. I appreciate the opportunity of hearing three brilliant people like yourselves discuss the issues. I suspect that if we had three equally distinguished economists with a different political persuasion, we'd have different answers and different observations. So let me get to my questions, okay? Number one, do you think the problems of the 99% are the result of what the 1% is doing to them? I don't want to monopolize the mic. I just want to ask you 3 questions and I'll disappear. So first question, is the problems of the 99% the result of what the 1% has done to them? Secondly, what do you think the appropriate maximum tax rate should be on the highest incomes in society? And 3, how would you narrow the income differential between the factory floor worker and the CEO? 30 years ago, that differential was about 30 times. I think today it's about 500 times. Okay, and I wonder, how would you go about narrowing the differential? I assume the differential has occurred to some degree because China has brought down the wages of American factory workers. Now, why CEOs make what they make, I think, is an issue of governance. I totally agree with the observations you've made. But those 3 questions, if you could shed some light on your opinions.
Okay. Do the 1% cause the 99% problem?
Well, what I tried to explain before is that the difficulties of the 99%, of the middle, are a result of a whole host of different things that we've talked about. Yeah. Right now the major problem is the unemployment, but education, a whole host of financial sector deregulation, allowing predatory lending and abusive credit card practices and things like that. Now, you can say a lot of these are a result of the way our political process has passed rules and regulations and supported education or not supported education. And that is affected, not I wouldn't say by the 1%, but by the way money, the influence that money has had in our political process. So yes, a lot of their plight is as a result of that. I don't say all of it is. On the issue of corporate, the issue of the CEO pay relative to ordinary workers, a lot of that has to do with corporate governance. If we had stronger laws about say and pay, I think that would be curbed, at least to some extent.
It's a different ratio here than in other countries as
well. Australia, for instance, has a strong say and pay law, and a very different ratio, and their companies are, just as efficient as our companies.
Yeah, also a stronger labor movement. We've had a very heavy tilt of policy against labor organizing, and that's an important restraining factor. And about the middle question, the answer is 73%.
73%.
No, that's Peter Diamond, who's a former colleague of mine and Nobel laureate and deemed unqualified to be on the Federal Reserve Board, but anyway, by Republicans in Congress. But it's actually, you don't have to take that exact number, but although he did actually put in, that's not a plucked out of a hat. That's done with a lot of careful estimation. But there's a very strong economic argument that says that basically we should be taxing very high incomes at rates that yield revenue.
Where does
and
that
there's one more factor.
Well, it doesn't quite, that we don't know. I mean, I think it's above my pay grade, but
after this book sells, you might be moving
right.
Way up.
But there's a clear case. The notion that you need to keep tax rates at the top low because of these wonderful spillovers, it's just not right. It's not borne out by theory or evidence, and at much higher rates than we currently have at the very high end would actually be perfectly reasonable.
And remember, we were talking before about the period before 1980 and after 1980. Before 1980, with the period where we were growing the fastest, top tax rates were 70%.
That's right, with 70%.
Now, there's one more thing that I would add, which is you ought to think a little bit about the sources of income at the top. And if you identify a lot of the sources of income are monopoly power, all kinds of rent seeking, if you can target taxes on that kind of rent seeking, you actually generate income and improve economic efficiency. So, most economists would say, to the extent that you could actually target those kinds of rents, you ought to tax that as close to 100% as you can.
I sense that if you had a higher marginal tax rate at the top, you would discourage the pursuit of rent-seeking.
There's actually
there's
a fair bit of evidence, actually, Piketty Sayas, but anyway, that that one of the reasons why we've had this explosion of corporate pay, of executive pay, is that the kind of brutal gaming of the system that CEOs now do in order to get these very high paychecks wasn't worth doing when the tax rates were much higher.
So the causality goes both ways, that when you have more economic inequality, the political process leads to less progressive taxation and more distorted tax system. But it's also when you have less progressive taxation and this kind of distortions, you wind up with an economic system with more inequality because people find it worthwhile to try to game the system.
Yeah, okay. Over to the left here.
Thank you. Sorry. Hello?
Yeah,
Oh, yes.
you're on.
Thank you.
Yes.
So there's been some criticism of the notion that economists as a group tend to look at the world as if the only thing that matters is efficiency and seeking the so-called rational solutions to problems of inefficiency. And I'm getting the strong sense that the two of you are not exactly in that camp, and that there's some sort of moral code that is at least in part underpinning your work and your views. And I wonder if you could articulate what that moral code is, a code for economists to live by.
Wow. I mean, I don't think the moral code for a person is any different if you're an economist than anything else. You try and do, but no, I think maybe, let me answer a slightly different question, which I think is related, which is what is your social vision? What is it you want to see? And I don't know if Joe would subscribe to this, but I think I am more or less a Rawlsian, without being too. The Rawls's notion was that you should think about society as if you were devising a society without knowing who you were going to be within it. That you should think of it, the hypothetical, the veil of ignorance. Say, if I didn't know whether I was going to be born the son of a corporate executive or the son of a migrant worker, what kind of society would I look for, given that it's really uncertain? So that it's a little bit like a golden rule sort of thing. That just consider the possibility of what would you want if you were going to be someone else, and that's you don't have to be super formal about it, but I think that's the way. That's actually there was a great line saying that one of our two presidential candidates, instead of the veil of ignorance, starts from a social philosophy that starts from the veil of arrogance, which I thought was kind of nice. But anyway.
Yeah, let me just add one other thing, that some of the arguments we've been talking about this evening say that no matter what your view about your moral philosophy is, that the level of inequality that we've achieved in the United States is bad for almost all of us.
Yeah.
That we've actually got, pushed the boundary beyond the point of where all of us in a way will suffer. So if we thought about this in terms of our enlightened self-interest, the 1% thought about it in terms of their enlightened self-interest, they would realize that it's not probably in their interest.
So there's one long-term study on education and socioeconomic status that I always think of in this context. It turns out that in America right now, they looked at students by test score and by socioeconomic background and then tracked them for a number of years later. And it turns out that in America right now, basically a dumb rich kid is more likely to graduate college than a poor smart kid. That is telling you that there's an enormous waste of human potential, that there are millions, probably tens of millions of young Americans who could be doing great things for themselves and for the rest of us, who, because we have such an unequal society, are being denied that chance. So that's
and
the
it's not
point
only equality, it's equality of opportunity, where again we are performing the worst of any of the advanced countries.
And the notion that you can divorce equality of results from equality of opportunity turns out to be false. When the results are so unequal, it turns into an equality of opportunity as well.
I'll make a little plug. INET's doing a joint venture with the Union Theological Seminary Joe Stiglitz kicked off the first in discussing his book about a month ago. And we'll be continuing that and filming that for our website at ineteconomics.org. And the gentleman who asked the question, I'll have to meet with you afterwards and get you an invitation to the next session, which is George Akerlof talking about the formation of identity on November 28th. Let's see, question on the side.
Thank you. When I look at the last decade, I see $5 trillion in debt run up under the Bush administration, a roughly comparable amount under the Obama administration. This $10 trillion seems to me to be a legacy of an extraordinary amount of pump priming, fiscal pump priming. And yet we have a legacy of economic problems. And now our sovereign debt is roughly around GDP. And this is the point at which, at least in Europe, investors have begun to question the capacity of the country to repay the debt. So I'm curious in what way future pump priming would be posed as a solution to problems that the past pump priming was not, and how can it be financed given our current balance sheet?
No, so I don't buy the premise, first of all. Look, we had a stimulus bill, which was about $800 billion. That's a very small part of this debt we have. And none of the rest was the result of deliberate efforts at economic stimulus. So where is this coming from? I mean, the rest of it is we have a large amount of debt that was, large amount of, we ran deficits even during good years, which even people like myself don't think is a good idea. Why? Because George Bush wanted to give tax cuts to high-income individuals, and he wanted to have a couple of unfunded wars. That has nothing to do with pump priming. And then we had a collapse of revenue that took place after 2007, which is the result of a severe downturn and financial crisis, which reflects, at least in part, financial deregulation, a failure to understand that you need to actually have some oversight on a financial system and all of that. So the notion, this is that people talk as if we got our current level of debt through Keynesian policies. We didn't. It had very little to do with it. We got into our current level of debt through a combination of a more or less deliberate policy of starving the beast when the economy didn't need a budget deficit, coupled with mishandling of financial policy that helped create this economic crisis. All of that said, the notion that that bad things happen, that there's some red line on debt that we're somewhere close to, is just not borne out by the evidence. Yeah. It's a really poor piece of look at who is in trouble right now in terms of debt, and it turns out to be only countries that are no longer have their own currencies, and are in a special problem. I mean, the advanced countries that still have their own currencies, that have monetary independence, have repeatedly, both in current events and historically, been able to handle debt levels like we have right now without any trouble.
This is a fallacy that's been partly propagated by a well-known book by Rogoff and Reinhardt.
It's not in your book. That's very important. Reinhardt and Rogoff, Carmen Reinhardt and Ken Rogoff have a wonderful book about history of crises, although there's some mistakes. But then after the book, they threw out this very casual paper, which was just some raw correlations, saying that basically countries with high debt seem to have low growth. And if you start to look at it, it looks like it's actually the other way around. Countries that have low growth end up with high debt. It's really just not up to the standard of their other work.
The United States had a debt to GDP ratio at the end of World War II of about 130%. And it was followed by the highest period of economic growth that we had, and we brought the debt down relatively quickly. So this notion that there is any magic number at which there's a problem is just false. The counterfactual, the way you should have asked the question, could have asked the question, is what would have happened?
Teacher,
yes. If this goes on for any length of time, one of us is going to say, that's a really good question. Right?
What would have happened if we hadn't allowed the deficit to increase? If we had tried to do the Herbert Hoover kind of policy of slash and cut back expenditures as the tax revenue went down. We did that experiment. And IMF has forced that experiment on a number of other countries. And the ECB in Europe have been forcing that on Greece. And we found two things about that. One, the countries go into depression. And the other one is the deficit doesn't get down as much as anybody hopes. They keep saying, oh, we're surprised. I'm surprised that they're surprised. Because it was perfectly anticipated that they would fail.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity of for asking this question. So my question is slightly on a different topic, but it relates to the kinds of economic ideas that some U.S. groups have been promoting abroad. I'm an international student from Georgia, and this summer I went back and I went to an economics camp, which surprisingly was funded by a Tea Party organization, and they were promoting libertarianism among Georgian students. And there has been an emergence of orthodox economists back home, which has led to deregulation, less taxes, but also an increase of inequality. So my question is, how do you discuss alternatives to market fundamentalism in post-Soviet countries, which are so sensitive to this, to their historical experiences?
I missed which the country was?
Georgia.
Georgia, okay.
I couldn't hear the
Well,
question.
I think part of the, it's not a surprise that people in countries where there was excessive government intervention, like communism, would react by going to the other extreme. So in that sense, I'm not surprised. But hopefully, and in particular, there's a real risk they go from one orthodoxy, fundamentalism, to another kind of orthodoxy, fundamentalism. And I hope that one of the things that INET is trying to do is to try to say, look, market fundamentalism doesn't work, just like the kind of Marxism doesn't work. You need to have a balanced role, and a couple of the things that we've been talking about are some of the roles that government can play, that we don't have to pick up the theme of Paul's book, we don't have to accept just a recession. A libertarian would say, just let the market work, and there are people who have said that. Don't do anything, just let, just let the ashes burn, and out of, there was one op-ed in the New York Times that said this from Chicago, said, just let the markets have their way, they'll all collapse, and out of the ashes will come a new economy. In the meanwhile, there's going to be a lot of suffering.
I was going to say that's the H. Rap Brown theory of economics. Right?
Yeah. You're showing your age and mine.
Yeah, burn, baby, burn.
Burn, baby, burn.
Yeah,
and I mean, maybe the thing to say, it's a little bit narrower than that, but we've now been, we're now almost 5 years into this crisis, and different economic ideas have people have made predictions. People have had not so much what the number for GDP, but how things will work. There were predictions. There was a widespread belief 2.5 years ago that austerity programs would actually expand the economy because we'd be getting the government out of the way. Well, we now have pretty clear evidence that doesn't work that way. We have, the different economic doctrines have, in a lot of ways, been subjected to a test of events. And what has survived is what has worked is an economic view, a view of how these things work that does support a case for government intervention. So it's not just let's have these abstract principles and throw them out. You have to look at what has actually worked in practice, and it's not the libertarian market fundamentalist view.
And there's one aspect that picks up on a point that we mentioned a little bit earlier. One of the standard doctrines of, you might say, the libertarian is more flexible wages, no unions. The economy is going to perform better. And the countries in which they have stronger unions and better job protection have done better in responding to the crisis. The United States, which is, quote, the best country in terms of labor market flexibility hasn't done that well. So it's another experiment. I mean, what's really interesting from the point of view of economics, economic theory, and is this crisis has been wonderful. We've gotten a lot of experiments, and we will be able to test a lot of different hypotheses, and it's shedding a light on a lot of different issues, at a great cost to a lot of people in a lot of these countries.
Yeah.
Over here.
This is a question addressed to both of you. What is your view on the standard decision theory of subjective expected utility in academic economics? Does it describe reality? Does it, especially considering your experiences in international economics and asymmetric information and other related matters?
Wow. All right.
Why don't you try, Paul?
Look, we had a lot of economics is built around the notion of this idealized Homo economicus, the rational man who's got utility, who has really a clear ordering of preferences, and which you can sometimes even express as a mathematical function, and who makes rational decisions given all of that, which obviously is not a literal description of anybody. The question, it's a metaphor that's helpful for organizing your thinking about how decisions are made. And I think the way to do it is to always think about it in the subjunctive. If it were the case that people were like that, then they would do this, which can offer you some guidance about how they actually behave. Any economist who believes that the expected utility model of decision making under uncertainty is a literal description of how people make decisions probably should find another profession. But it nonetheless is very useful.
Yeah. Let me say, there are two parts of the question. One of them is, there's a lot of research over the last 30 years that show that people's behavior in making decisions under uncertainty is not well described by the model that Paul and you mentioned, that there are significant deviations of behavior from the prediction of that model. On the other hand, that when we think about the issue of where do probability distributions come from? Are they objective or are they subjective? The view that we ought to think of them as relatively subjective, that they reflect our experience, the way we see the world based on our experience, I think that has a lot of persuasion that to the extent that we use those probabilities and we behave according to them, then the subjective probability approach of Savage does make a lot of sense.
One more question over here.
Hi, thanks for coming. As the panel discussed earlier, the United States was able to get out of the Great Depression by government spending because of World War II and on manufacturing, in a large sense. But currently we're already at war, and the manufacturing landscape in the United States is drastically different than it was 70 years ago. And in light of those 2 points, where would you direct this government spending?
Okay, this is actually how I concluded End This Depression Now, my book. Let me start. The good news is that there are some natural recuperative forces already at work. So if you look, we built very few houses in this country for 6 years now. So there is no longer an excess housing stock. Probably, if we were anywhere close to full employment, we would actually probably have a housing shortage. And you can see housing is starting to come back. Household debt is down. It's still high by historical levels, but not as much. So there's a lot of reasons to think that the economy is somewhat on the mend. Actually, if you look the last year, there's been a significant improvement in labor markets. So the point is that the hill that needs to be climbed is not as steep as it was. You don't have to have a World War II level stimulus to get us back to a much, much better economic situation. And this kind of stimulus you do want, a lot of it can be achieved just by reversing this austerity that we have in fact carried out. So Joe and I both have this number. We're down 600,000 government jobs, mostly state and local, when we should be up by normal growth. We should be up more than 1 million. So right there you can create a lot of, you can create directly 1.5 million, 1.6 million, 1.7 million jobs, and then including indirect effects, probably 2.5 million or more, just by basically restoring normal levels of funding for schools, for road construction, for road repair, for the functions of government that we already have. We don't need to find exotic projects. We don't need to find something that we unprecedented to spend on. Just returning to where we would be under normal operation gets us probably to an unemployment rate well below 7%. So it's not hard.
Yeah, but let me just say, I think to get back to really full employment, we will need to do more than that. I mean, if you look back, say, a comparison of where we were in 2007 and where we are likely to be, right. We won't have real estate anything like we had before because we were irrationally exuberant. We won't have consumption like we had before, zero savings rate. You know, whether it's 4, 5, 6, it's still going to be well above where we were. And we are going to continue to have the problem of the trade deficit, almost surely, unless things change very dramatically. So the good news is that we have lots of things that we need to invest in. Education, infrastructure, retrofitting the economy for global warming. You know, there are lots of needs that we have. So in my mind, particularly since we can borrow now at negative real interest rates, we don't need to do anything exotic. And there is really, let me make another important point. There's this flaw, this view that it was war spending that got us out. War spending is not any different from other kind of spending, except in one way. You don't have anything left over after you drop those bombs. Whereas if you actually build roads, you have something left over. So even if you don't do it perfectly, it's better than that war spending. So the fact is that all of this kind of spending would actually put us in a better stead than the kind of spending that we had to do in World War II.
Okay, I'm running short on time here, and my staff today begged me. They said, you have two of the great original thinkers and Nobel laureates on stage with you, and Rob, give them the wheel. The last question for the Institute of New Economic Thinking. What new economic thinking do you think we should pursue, develop, enhance? Questions for each one of you.
Wow. Part of the problem is I think you really want to ask the question of a younger guy. Because there is this problem of having been in it so long, you have your own set way of thinking. But look, I think we need a lot more empirical work, a lot more evidence-based work. We're seeing a renaissance, certainly in the areas I'm interested in. We're actually seeing a lot of really good empirical work on things like the effects of fiscal policy, which was much neglected. And neglected partly because it didn't seem to be a live issue, but also because we had this sort of crippling orthodoxy of believing that everything must be derived from rational behavior of individuals, and if you can't derive it that way, then it must not exist. And if we adopt a kind of looser jointed, more open-minded way of approaching how the economy works, then I think we open the door I don't think we're ready for a lot of grand new theories at this point, but I think we have the opportunity to have a lot of people looking at how things actually work. What actually happens in a recession? What actually happens in a recovery? What happens when spending is increased or cut? We're getting a lot of natural experiments out of, bad times are good for generating interesting data. And that's where I would go. I'm sure there's a lot more stuff.
And economic history.
History, yes. Well, there was this great line, actually, two things. One was, I think it was Mark Thoma, the Economist View blog, who said that after attending an INET conference, he said that new economic thinking seems to consist in large part of rereading old books, which is true. I mean, there was a lot of forgetting. But the other is, yes, we've learned that history is a really powerful tool. That in some ways it is. We've been there was a lot of empirical work in economics was being dictated by where the data were easy to get and clean, and which means modern times. But it turns out that a lot of the interesting events mean going further back and further afield. Also, by the way, it's a special thing. International, we're better about this, but there's particularly in this country, there's a tendency to have to do economic research as if America was the only country. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of experiences out there, economics, the principles do tend to stay the same across time and across space. Not forever and not everywhere, but you can learn a lot. If we had paid more attention, if we'd paid more attention to Japan and its experiences in the 90s, we wouldn't be doing such a bad job here right now.
Cool.
Well, I don't know where to begin. Since we have only a limited amount of time, it will take a couple hours to really talk about how to begin a new economic thinking. The point where I agree very strongly with Paul is that there needs to be more openness in the way that economics is approached. I'm not sure whether the really relevant focus ought to be on empirics. I mean, a lot of the problem is the theory that was brought to bear in seeing the world led them to look at the world through the wrong empirical lens. So there are, for 25 years, 30 years, there has been a lot of empirical work in economics driven with the view that markets are rational, everybody's rational expectations. So they have this very strong lens, and anything that was outside that lens, somehow they couldn't see. And they shaped all the empirics into that frame. There is even today, there's a professor at Harvard, even after the crisis, who's been writing a paper saying that there's this notion of expansionary contraction, that somehow austerity actually leads to economic growth in a number of instances.
Well, but that's what we've had I guess it's a triumph that basically nobody believes that anymore because they've actually looked hard at the evidence, and it doesn't stop him from keeping on writing papers along those lines. But yeah, I think we learned something there.
Yeah, but I guess what it seems to me is that what is really important is changing the mindset with which we approach the data and the way we see the world. Within the different fields of economics, it seems to me very clear the field that has done miserably is macroeconomics and monetary economics. And to a somewhat lesser extent, but also financial economics. These were fields that macroeconomics had the view, that bubbles don't exist, that markets are efficient. And it was really the central doctrine of a very large fraction of the macroeconomics profession. They actually had models used by central banks in which there were no banks. You might say that's very peculiar. How could a central bank actually talk about macroeconomics without banks? Well, they did. And their predictions were very bad, and their ability to respond to the crisis once it happened was not very good. And when it happened, they would make statements like, oh, don't worry, the crisis is contained. when it obviously wasn't. So in my mind, as we look across the fields, the big failure was in macroeconomics, in finance, where, like I said, these financial markets had all these efficient properties, and a lot of people actually believed those models, and that was really the big mistake, both in the public and the private sector, and with enormous consequences.
And yet,
for all
if
of
you
us.
did read those old books, or those old, the odd thing is that if you had a view of macroeconomics based on what was widely accepted knowledge before this super rational expectations thing came in, ISLM, if that kind of thing, you've actually done spectacularly well in this crisis. I mean, it's been actually, there were obviously, I think of myself as one of the people who did that, but it came in with these things that seemed absurd to a lot of people. The notion that big budget deficits would not drive up interest rates, that big increases in the monetary base would not be inflationary, that this would in fact be a much slower recovery than normal because we'd be up against the zero lower bound on interest rates. It's a whole series of propositions which have turned out to be borne out by events. It's in a funny way, this has been a period of triumph for macroeconomic theory, except it's a macroeconomic theory that a lot of the profession threw in the wastepaper basket, even though it was still perfectly valid.
And then to refer back to, you mentioned about economic history, the notion that there were no bubbles was really quite remarkable, because anybody who had read, as I had, one of my teachers was Charlie Kinderberger, who wrote this wonderful book
all of us, yeah.
about the history of panics and
Manias, panics, and crashes.
Yeah. And they've happened since the beginning of capitalism. And one of the things that was so interesting in this book is he describes in each of these bubbles, each of these booms, that the people in the boom knew that there had been previous bubbles that broke, but they thought they were smarter than their parents, and that they themselves were not in one of these bubbles. And that was exactly what happened in this case, that a few of the people in the middle of the bubble said, yes, of course, back in the Middle Ages, 20 years ago, we had bubbles, but we're so much smarter than our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents, so we would never fall for the kinds of things that they fell for, but of course we fell for things that were just a little bit more complicated, but in many ways very similar to the same kinds of traps that they fell into, from Bertie Madoff all the way on to more sophisticated things.
So I'll take from this concluding question the notion that we should try to inoculate people from the position that they only see what they believe. And we should try to bring them back to believe that which they see.
Yeah, if not, a little bit of humility here is a very powerful thing. Let's see what a humble person I am, and Joe too, actually. But seriously, the accepting that maybe you don't have the truth with two capital T's, that maybe these beautiful models that you've been teaching are not the only way to see the world. We had this tremendous doctrinariness about macroeconomics, amazingly without any
evidence.
Without any empirical triumphs to justify it, and intellectual arrogance is almost certainly a really bad thing.
What's quite remarkable is that some of the advocates of those models that failed so badly have actually written that this is the era, even now, of the triumph of macroeconomics. So what it shows is that some parts of economics are immune to reality,
Wow.
and they are a religion, not a science. And hopefully, INET will be able to make a dent in that kind of armor.
Yes, that's what. It's and those people will never admit that they were wrong. But it's that's the old line. I'm reading about for light reading, I'm reading about the development of quantum theory, and I think it was Max Planck who said that science progresses funeral by funeral.
Well, I think tonight, far from a funeral, I think tonight you brought a lot of life to this audience, to the questions of economics, the challenge of INET, and I'm grateful to you both for an excellent discussion. And thank you all for being here.
All right.